our bat species are clearly in trouble. We have introduced predators, habitat loss, light pollution, urban development. You can get quite technical as an ecologist and what's the threat status and what's this and that. I think if you were anybody in the public, I would say, well, bats need your help. They're clearly in trouble, no matter what classification you put them in. A healthy ecosystem will have the presence of a myriad of species and species that require healthy forests, for example, which bats do. If you have bats present, you can infer that the things that they require are present. And so therefore for bats, we might be able to say for short-tail specifically that you have large tracts of contiguous forest that are in reasonable health, right? Because the bats require that. In terms of like insect control, there's a really good paper recently out that they've linked the recent increase in pesticide use that was required in the USA off the back of the white nose syndrome decimating bat populations because the insects were not being eaten by bats. We had to control them with pesticide. We're now linking that to increased human health conditions. So in terms of ecosystem service, where we try to replace that service with a man-made function like pesticide, we can actually start to see the benefits that bats provide. That's quite a big one that's underestimated. And I think for us in New Zealand, where we don't seem to see bats all that often, and our numbers are presumably much, much lower than they were even in the early 1900s, that's probably some ecosystem service that we have lost by virtue of the bat populations declining. There's a lot of data that's collected but never makes it to the public realm, which means then it can't flow through to conservation planning and even to other projects and developments that would like to use that data and leverage it to have a better understanding of what the potential impact is. That's something I'd like to see change for sure, is the contribution of data to this central database. And the big push that I'm making this year with the National Bat Survey is to allow people to upload data to a platform where we have an automated classifier.
Hello, kia ora. I'm Anna.
And I'm Callum from Conservation Amplified.
And you're listening to the People Helping Nature podcast.
Our mission is to make conservation mainstream, one topic at a time.
Today is a discussion about all things New Zealand bats, and we're lucky to be joined by Mark Roper, senior ecologist and bat expert with expertise in New Zealand and around the world. Mark, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, team. Looking forward to having a chat.
So zooming into New Zealand bats, they're quite special here compared to other areas of the world. They're our only native land mammal, and all of the species we have are endemic, so they only exist here in New Zealand. So as far as I understand it, we used to have 3 species. Now we're down to 2 within Aotearoa. Can you give us a bit more of an overview about the species we have here and what makes them unique?
Yeah, so we often quote that we have 2 species and we reference our greater short-tail as being extinct. I think it was last sighted in 1967. I believe that was like trapped, so somebody had it in the hand. I don't think there's acoustic recordings of that species, but we consider it to be extinct. That's not definitive. I have my fingers crossed that it's out there. It exists somewhere on an offshore island perhaps, but we tend to reference our other 2. So the long-tail bat, which is the species I've worked with the most and is probably the least distinct of the 2 remaining. It has close relatives in Australia, like the wattled bats is the group that it belongs to. So we have some good analogues for if we start thinking about like impact assessments and things like that. We have species that we can relate to that have similar habits, niches that they occupy, the kind of things that they require for roosting, their breeding cycle, things like that. But then in terms of the short tail, which is really what you would consider to be like, that's a unique species. That's a unique bat. So we have 3 subspecies within that species: northern, central, and southern. Classic New Zealand like naming strategy. But the uniqueness about them is that they're in a family group that it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So that alone is quite unique in terms of the genetics, the species, how it's formed, where it's come from. There are no other bats in this group. And then combined with the fact that they're able to walk on the ground, and that's not just sort of crawl or scutter, or a lot of bats can obviously move on trees and they can walk around, kind of, you'd say walk, but this species really walks. They're designed to be mobile on 4 points of contact and walking around. The only other bat that I know of that does that is the common vampire bat. So they've adapted to these niches. I guess for our short tail on the forest floor, they're occupying a niche that would have been available here because we didn't have previously these land-based mammals, right? So they've expanded into a niche that's perhaps occupied by another species elsewhere in the world. So that's really unique. The pollination that they perform for things like the wood rose, that is unique in the bat world, but it's not as unique as being able to walk on the ground. There's a number of other species that pollinate. Even in Australia, you have, I think it's the blossom bat, for example, just to think of one. So plants and bats have these relationships. together. But yeah, certainly for our bat fauna, it's the short tail that's most unique.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And do we have an estimate of the current numbers of our native bats in the wild?
It's sort of a yes and a no answer from me. If we look at the most recent conservation threat status documents for the northern short tail, you're looking at a population on an offshore island of about 2,000. And that'll be probably one colony. There's another mainland population, which I think is 1,000. But the numbers from there, that I've taken that just from the most recent reporting. That's not an area that I'm au fait with. The central short tails, the last reported numbers were 15,000 across 5 known roosts. So that's from like pit tagging, I think, where they have counters that count them coming in and out. And so the conservation threat status puts them in a category from between 20 and 100,000. But I'm going to say it's definitely on the lower end of that. And then for the southern, which I think has only 3 known populations, they're like 400, 500, but they're increasing off the back of predator control. So that's a positive trend. That subspecies is nationally increasing. So that's great. But again, the conservation threat status would put their population at just over 1,000, but less than 5,000. So for short tails there's not many, long tails, national population number, I don't know. But what I do know for conservation threat status is that their population is declining 70%, I think, over 3 generations. So 5 to 9% per year or something. So they're not in a good place, but they're more widely distributed than the short tails. So sort of a different risk profile for both of those species, if you like. But I guess if you wanted to put it into a soundbite, I mean, our bat species are clearly in trouble. We have introduced predators, habitat loss, light pollution, urban development. We have one species that we think is extinct. That's obviously not that common, So, yeah, you can get quite technical as an ecologist and what's the threat status and what's this and that. I think if you were anybody in the public, I would say, well, bats need your help. They're clearly in trouble, no matter what classification you put them at. Even the short tails that are increasing, they're starting from a low population base, they're a small number of populations, and they're range restricted.
And I guess they're only increasing because we're actively helping them, right? They're not doing it by themselves. So before we dig deeper, why are bats important to the ecosystem? You've already mentioned that the short tails do a lot of pollination on the forest ground, but what role do they play?
The way I've utilized them in my consultancy career is like they're an indicator, right? And this is utilized worldwide. Like a healthy ecosystem will have the presence of a myriad of species and species that require healthy forests, for example, which bats do. If you have bats present, you can infer that the things that they require are present. And so therefore for bats, we might be able to say for short tail specifically that you have large tracts of contiguous forest that are in reasonable health, right? Because the bats require that. So if bats are present, you can infer that of the environment. So they're a really useful monitor and indicator species. That's something they provide to us, I guess. But in terms of like insect control, there's a really good paper recently out last year that they've linked the recent increase in pesticide use that was required in the USA off the back of the white nose syndrome decimating bat populations because the insects were not being eaten by bats. We had to control them with pesticide. And now we're starting to find in those areas, so the areas that were most heavily impacted by white nose syndrome, which for those that don't know is a fungus that kills bats during hibernation, we're now linking that to increased human health conditions. So in terms of ecosystem service, where we try to replace that service with a man-made function like pesticide, we can actually start to see the benefits that bats provide. So insect control, while it's like hard to find concrete numbers, there are some out there for specific locations in specific countries. That's quite a big one that's underestimated. And I think for us in New Zealand, where we don't seem to see bats all that often, and our numbers are presumably much, much lower than they were even in the early 1900s, that's probably some ecosystem service that we have lost by virtue of the bat populations declining.
Would that come into disease prevention as well, if the insects are overrun?
Outside my realm of expertise, really, but I know where I used to live in Sweden, because of the flooding of the river it was controlled, and they had a huge problem with mosquitoes and other flying, biting insects that did spread disease. So again, what they've done there is they've opted to kill those insects in their larval stage in the floodwaters. So they're spraying chemical on the land to prevent them from hatching, right? Now that would be foreseeably something that bats would have controlled historically. So we are seeing you have like the monetary cost of us having to develop a system to now provide that service for ourselves, whereas nature was providing that before. Yeah, and then you have the secondary effect of the impacts of what we've had to put in place on us again.
A really good point. So can you give us a rough timeline of like how bat conservation and their decline around Aotearoa has progressed?
From the early 1900s, there were records of bats being quite prolific, and you would use that word. I don't think we use that word anymore in New Zealand for bats. They're not prolific anywhere. But in terms of like what steps have been taken for like conservation and things like that, I guess the first big event where bats were included was the establishment of the Wildlife Act. So that was in 1953. We still use that legislation today. Fast track changes might be altering that process slightly. We'll see how that shakes out. But in 1953, the Wildlife Act was put in place protections for bats. Interestingly, it still omitted the protection of roost trees that were unoccupied. That's a bit of a debate issue for us here in New Zealand as ecologists, that it's not treated in the same way as it is in other countries, where a bat roost, even though it's not occupied currently by bats, is still protected because it is a bat roost, even in the absence of the bat actually being there. In the 90s, the Bat Recovery Group, which still exists today, was set up to think about how are we going to conserve bats. And 95 was the last version of a recovery plan that I could find. Now that's 30 years old, that recovery plan. I think it's still the most current version, but if it's not, someone please correct me. I would really hope that that's not the latest version.
Yeah, that's a long way. So why are we seeing that decline? You mentioned invasive predators before, mammals introduced into New Zealand by humans. What effect do they have? What's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, if you put in the big threats for bats, habitat loss is certainly a big one. So they require trees with cavities. All manner of roost features can exist in trees. Caves are also used, although that's much less documented in New Zealand, but I suspect it was more prevalent historically. But in terms of introduced predators, that's really a big one, just because the bat species here obviously evolved in the absence of those predators, so they're not well adapted to dealing with them. And also because they are roosting. If you think about maternity season, for example, the bats will all congregate together and they'll have their young in one place. Now, longtails do move around frequently, like every night, every other night. And some people think that might be a response to this predation risk. I'm not sure if that was a behavior that was done prior to the introduction of these predators or not, but the introduced predators, basically, they just get eaten. It's a threat that they're not well adapted to avoid. Think about an animal like a cat, like a feral cat. They can hear the ultrasonic calls of bats as well, so they're relatively easy to locate. And then once a roost is found, it's quite an easy prey source. So there's a lot of images out there, if you want to do some research about it, of cats consuming large numbers of bats.
Cats are a big issue because they'll find a food source and they'll just eat it till it's gone, right? They don't kind of find a food source and then stash some food away and find the next one. They just, like milk.
Depleted.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's interesting too for a cat, right? Like it's an interesting kind of an animal that they're quite vocal, bats. And they're small, so they're for a cat, you can just imagine that that's a really hard thing to leave alone. In Europe, that they are still an issue. Cats will often bring in bats, but interestingly, it doesn't seem to be the same type of issue that we have here in New Zealand. These pictures of like cats' bellies filled with bats is not something that I've seen coming out of Europe.
So how do offshore islands and fenced eco-sanctuaries play a role in their conservation? Like, is that something that's an active part of their protection?
In relation to bats and like predator-free or rat-free islands, I believe there's 2 islands that are rat-free that have bat populations on them. But then there are other islands that don't have bats but are rat-free. So there was a translocation project, I think it's mid-2000s, of short-tails to Kapiti, but it was unsuccessful. I believe a few of the bats may have died. Others got returned to captivity, I think, for health reasons. So the bat recovery plan that I mentioned before in 95, that does highlight that the use of offshore islands would be beneficial to get us some secure populations, right? But you've got the issue that if you don't have extant bat populations, you have to get them there and establish them. So there's a lot of work that would have to go into ensuring that the habitat requirements could be fulfilled there as well. So it's quite complicated to set that up.
With offshore islands and fenced eco-sanctuaries, like mice are a big problem we struggle to remove. In German, the word for bat is Fledermaus, which is like flying mouse. So I'm wondering, are mice a threat to them? Like, are they too small to really worry about it?
No, I haven't heard reports that mice are a threat to bats, but yeah, the Swedish word fledermaus, it's the same type of, like a flummouse. I think Old English, like flittermouse, it was the same. It's interesting if you go back to the short tail and foraging on the ground. that similar kind of a niche, right? Potentially some sort of competition, maybe, but predation, yeah, I haven't heard about that. Some species of bats, I'm not sure if they would eat mice, for example, but bats eat other bats. Bats eat birds. So bats can kind of hold their own against a lot of stuff, or different species of bats at least.
Yeah,
But no,
they've
I
got
haven't heard
vicious.
it. When you get down in the weeds and you're IDing bats by looking at their teeth, the variation's huge, and they are very, very task specific. So yeah, when you see pictures of bats with an open mouth, like baring teeth and stuff, it's not the best way to portray bats, I don't think. But from my point of view, it's interesting to see the teeth because you can infer what kind of niche they might be occupying.
That is super interesting. And I guess birds are the same, right? Their beak tells you a lot about what their niche is. So in terms of monitoring bats in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or the pika, which is the te reo word for bats, what's currently being done and how do you actually monitor bats? Because yes, cats can hear them, but humans can't. Is that right?
Yeah, so we tend to have our hearing when we're young is about 20 kilohertz is about the maximum. I think kids maybe 18 kilohertz, so that's quite low. Bats would echolocate. For our species, the short tail starts at about 28 kilohertz, so that's above our hearing already. The long tails are at about 32 to 38 probably is their peak frequency, so well outside our audible range. Social calls, for people who have been near a bat roost, you'll be able to hear bats chittering and talking to each other. When they're doing this kind of communication, that's usually between 10 and 20, sometimes even a little bit lower. So we can hear that. So when you hear a bat making a noise, it'll be this social type of calling where it's communicating rather than when it's echolocating to navigate or to find prey. So the bioacoustics is one way that we can monitor bats. The limitation with acoustics is that it doesn't infer anything about the number of bats. You might say, well, we have more bat recordings, we would have more bats. That may be true, but it may also be you have a small number of bats that are very active in a particular area. That's where breaking down a call is quite beneficial. So is it a commuting style call? Is it a foraging call? So for people who are involved in acoustics, you can really, a bit like the teeth, you can go way down in the weeds and learn a lot about what that particular bat was doing by the recordings that you have of it. Other ways of doing population estimates, for example, was mark and recapture. So if we set out traps and we trap a bat and we put a radio tracker on it and we track it back to a roost, we can then trap its roost mates, and by putting bands with individual numbers on the bats and then recapturing those individuals during the same year and in subsequent years, you can start to calculate some population estimates just based on what proportion of the population you're catching. For the short tails in New Zealand, they do pit tagging as well, where the animals are the same as what you would have maybe in your cat or your dog, that someone can scan like a unique identifier, and then at the roost entrance, they would have a receiver, and so it can track the ingress and egress of an individual, and again, year over year, you can use that to build some estimates. But getting really accurate population estimates are quite difficult. When I was working in Whirinaki 2 or 3 years ago, we trapped a roost where we pulled out 273 bats, I think it was, into a harp trap, bats that were emerging. Before that, we thought the biggest roost recorded was 120 individuals. So the more work that we continue to do, the more we're learning. So I think it's important to always remember that there's this little bit of precautionary. You have to be a little bit aware that you don't know what you don't know, yet we operate on the information we have at present.
So hearing that, is it fair to presume that there's a little bit of data deficiency going on for our bat species in Aotearoa?
Yeah, I think more data is always better. I'm obviously focused on the acoustics a lot. So when you look at like the distribution map, which Doc has recently put up online, a fantastic resource that people should definitely go to find. It makes the distribution mapping like really accessible to many more people. So definitely check that out. That's a great resource to have. But what it does highlight for me is the paucity of our detection, like survey results and the records that are available for us to map the distribution. You'll see if you look at that map, and we talked about it before, that long-tailed bats are much more widely distributed. So one of the limitations, as we said, with the acoustic data is that while they might be widely distributed in terms of they're found in a lot of places, it doesn't give you much information about how many individuals there are. So with the short tails, you know much more where they are because they're quite localized. But again, the acoustic doesn't tell you how many there are. But that's where these multitude of monitoring methods are quite key, because you want to have distribution so that if you have somebody like me working as an ecologist doing an impact assessment, which species are relevant to me here. And that's still, it's hard to know with certainty. I mean, most people would consider the long tail, that's the species that you're looking to manage. But I think by virtue of not looking hard enough for our second species, that there may be places where it exists that we don't currently know. And that's just a survey effort thing, which is hard because it's a time and cost issue, right? It costs money to go survey large expanses to find creatures. So if there's no direct need, like from a developer, it's hard to justify going to do that. And yet it's critical to assessing the population size and distribution and the conservation strategy for these species.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's easy to look at a population estimate or a conservation status and just take the data for granted and say, okay, well, that must be reliable. Someone's done work on it. But we often forget that the amount of manual labor and mahi that goes into this is quite large. And sometimes the more documented species are because they are near human development. So I'm really curious about what work's being done to protect them. And that obviously ties in part into commercial land developments. So how do commercial enterprises like wind farms or property developers or these types of financially driven businesses ensure their developments don't adversely affect native bat populations?
The first step is usually to do a bat survey, right, which is really valuable, it's valuable information. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of the times is because it's tied to a commercially sensitive, potentially project, that data is not released publicly. So there's a lot of data that's collected but never makes it to the public realm, which means then it can't flow through to conservation planning and even to other projects and developments that would like to use that data and leverage it to have a better understanding of what the potential impact is. That's something I'd like to see change for sure, is the contribution of data to this central database, because that's the starting point, right? Like you need to know where these things are so you can plan your mitigations, which is usually what a development project will do. So the first thing that they want to be doing for a project is to avoid impact. So if you did a survey and you found an area of your site was being utilized but another area wasn't, you would want to be avoiding the area that was being utilized. This might be a wetland for feeding potentially a flyway or roost trees, for example. And then you sort of want to be able to do minimization, and you want to remedy any effects. Then you can start moving through to offsetting and compensation, which are like less desirable than avoiding the impact altogether. If you tie it to like a wind farm, for example, which is one of the biggest threats to bats because it results in fatality potentially with collision with turbines. So that's not like a displacement effect. That's sort of on the more serious end if you're actually killing bats and removing them from a population that is under threat. But there are strategies in terms of like placement. So again, like avoidance is a key one. And then bringing in technology into how the turbines are run and operated in terms of they can detect bats and then they can start slowing down turbines, ceasing operations while there's bat activity in the area. So there's a lot of like really positive, firstly, research being done on bat behavior in terms of flight height behavior around turbines, for example, and then also the technology that follows up and behind that to think or to give operators options as to what they can do if they're operating in an area that bats are known to be present. How can you further reduce the impact? Right. And in my mind, having some sort of live curtailment, as it's called, is a really good one, because it balances things between the development, which wants to generate power, so turbines operating as much as possible, but then it also balances it with the bat activity that if there are bats present, the turbines are not going to be operating. So yeah, there's a myriad of ways, and they're all project specific. That was just one example, a wind turbine example, but there's a lot of people working very hard, firstly on the monitoring side that you alluded to before, like people like working in Department of Conservation and other groups to establish population numbers. And then on the other side of the fence, people working for consultancies looking to mitigate impacts.
I've got a follow-up question. So for that, is there a time frame in the year that they are more active than not? Do they hibernate here in New Zealand like they do overseas? And I guess also, as far as I'm aware, bats are nocturnal. So would that mean for the wind turbines that don't operate at night if we know that bats are present?
Yeah, so to take them sort of your questions in order there, the peak activity season that we specify in New Zealand is from the 1st of October till the end of April. And that the peak activity covers the period where obviously it's warmer temperatures moving into summer. Also covers the maternity period, sort of November, December, bats are giving birth, or longtails at least, and then moving through, and pups are becoming volant, flying around. So it's the more important end of the life cycle, or the annual cycle for bats, in terms of where they're most vulnerable from a predation point of view or impact point of view, can be where these maternity colonies are. But interestingly, to go through to the question about whether they hibernate or not, In New Zealand, bats don't hibernate, but they use torpor, which is what bats that hibernate use as well. But our bats they tend to go into torpor, like a lowered state of metabolic activity, for days at a time. Whereas in Europe, for example, where it gets deep cold and they are seeking out hibernacula that are 1 or 2 degrees above zero, very humid, and they will be inactive for much longer periods. And that's to conserve energy, right? That's the strategy. That's the approach that they've taken, is to survive winter by being inactive, not requiring food intake. They can live off fat reserves. Because it's not going to get down to the same temperatures in New Zealand, they've adapted a similar but different strategy. So they will reduce their energy output by using torpor and remaining in their roost for days at a time. And then when conditions are better and they can go out and forage, they will do so. So we tend to say that bats are active. I think the guidelines at the moment are 7 and 8 degrees. Bats can be active, of course, at lower temperatures. In Europe, bats are out even in minus degrees. It's just an energetics type of thing. In a lot of recent conversations, people always tell me, like, bats don't read the books. So we have these like guidelines that we like to say, this is peak season, it's this temperature, it's this wind speed. There's all these parameters that we like to use because we like to bucket things, right? That's how we understand the world. But then you work with bats and you realize that they don't do that stuff. You find bats that are doing stuff that they're not supposed to. And so, yeah, saying that bats haven't read the books is quite a common phrase. And the more into it, the more you realize that, yeah, they really, maybe they can't read.
And I think that goes across all species, not just bats. I think that's just like you say, it's our mechanism putting things into drawers, trying to understand the world, but not appreciating that nature doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's incredible that you can have these general guidelines, but it's always important to realize that while they are useful for your plans and what you might expect, you should always be aware that might not be how these bats or that bat behaves.
So looking at what's being done to protect it, how does DOC get involved? Obviously, they have the bat recovery group. What else do they do?
I believe that they're running quite a number of predator control programs as well. So they're running projects like in Whirinaki, down south in Elington, up north as well in Northland. So doing population studies to estimate population size and gather information about trends, and then also protecting areas around those known roost sites, for example. And that's predator control to reduce predation, like direct predation. And that's where these numbers from the recovery off the back of predator control come from. It's these long-term studies that, to my knowledge, are primarily done by Department of Conservation. I know Forest and Bird has a project down in Pelorus and the Rye Valley as well. So these kind of projects are really quite critical for, if you're proposing as a consultant a mitigation strategy or an offset and you're proposing pest control, for example, we will often reference these numbers that, hey, if you do this kind of pest control at this kind of scale, you could expect these numbers. So that kind of project work, not only is it important for the bats immediately that are being protected from predators and the numbers being monitored and the roost protected and things like that, it also provides a greater service to the bat population more generally, because people who are trying to plan mitigation or offsets are able to reference that data so that they know what kind of control and at what scale is required to get a known impact. Because I think without that, you might have a situation where people are doing predator control, but it's over a too small scale, for example. So like it might not cover an entire roost area or the habitat that bats are utilizing. So you're doing the right mechanism, but it's the wrong scale.
I find that really insightful because, like, you think, okay, if I'm developing land, I have an incentive to do the minimum to get myself across the line. And I know there's some really good developers out there that go above and beyond. But thanks for acknowledging the role that public institutions and larger NGOs like DOC and Forest and Bird play, because I've never really considered how that integrity of data actually affects the commercial space.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to think about too, the driver for collecting that data at a commercial scale, the person who's paying for that. I haven't come across a scenario in which a development I've been involved in has collected that kind of data at that time for time scale at a location that's not their impact site, right? Like it's not in line with what their impact is, but it's like the data is critical to the outcome or what they're proposing to do. So it would be fantastic to see a little bit more of like collaboration in that space. And I know this has been a discussion in the wind farm industry for a while, that there is some data that's out there. There's not a lot of pooled data, and so there's not a big repository of data for people doing developments to draw from. And I think that where we have a need for data, there's groups that are able to collect the data, but they require funding. It seems like there's a potential there somewhere. It's just getting across perhaps the political divide or some other kind of boundary that exists between these kind of groups. But again, that's sort of where my framework I'm trying to shift a little more is like this collaborative and transparent approach, that if your end goal is bat conservation, what would need to happen? And I think I'm taking the approach, and the problem I'm trying to solve is the distribution, increasing our knowledge of bat distribution, leveraging off the back of my acoustics knowledge. But there's multitude of other areas where people are collecting data that is relevant to other branches of bat conservation. So having somewhere where that's available to those people to utilize and supporting the people who are collecting that necessary data would be fantastic. Perhaps a new recovery plan can find a way to incorporate that stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate your viewpoint there. I think collaboration is so important to protect them throughout Aotearoa. And I think it'll be great for Doc to step up and have almost like a national database for bats. And it is, if you do any bat conservation and research, no matter if that's for a commercial mitigation program or if you were a community group, it has to go in there so we understand them better across the board. And I guess for me, I'm really into community conservation. So I'd be really interested what the community currently does, including private landowners on the conservation front for bats.
Yeah, I think just to circle back to your first point about Department of Conservation and public entities doing all that. So DOC does have that public database at the moment. They have released it online on a map. Moira's done a fantastic job doing that. And so full kudos to the Department of Conservation team and all those bat workers that have participated, past and present, and invited other people to come on board with those projects. That's a huge amount of work that goes on, oftentimes behind the scenes. It's not publicised. Yeah, there's a lot of people doing a lot of heavy lifting in that space, and it is appreciated, on all sides of the fence, I think, whether that's openly acknowledged or not. The point about making the data always publicly available, yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I can see the argument as to why it would not be publicly available, but my opinion is a little bit that you're collecting information about a species that somebody doesn't own. It's information about the environment that is, I believe, of national interest. If you're talking about a species that's nationally critical, I do have a little bit of a problem with keeping that data behind a paywall or not being published or shared in any way. And it seems to be that we're having to reinvent the wheel a lot as well. I'm sure there's a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives around that, but I think that's a conversation that we should be having. Some countries do require consultants, for example, that work with bats and record acoustic data. That is a requirement that you will submit that to a database. That's not negotiable. So yeah, that would be a great conversation to have here in New Zealand, I think. In terms of community groups, this is quite an exciting one, I think, because upon my return to New Zealand, I don't remember this from before I left, even a year or a little bit more ago. I didn't remember bats having such a favourable position with community groups. They were sort of on the periphery, but maybe it was too hard basket, or I'm not sure, funding or what the management methods would be. It wasn't as clear. But in my conversations, coming back to try to establish my citizen science project, a lot of community groups doing predator control have been really interested to know that bats are a really great monitor species in certain places for the efficacy of that control. The fact that you can pick up also rat vocalizations with ultrasonic recorders is also something that's been of interest to people. So you can not only be monitoring for your target species like bats, but it can give you an early warning of that you have an incursion potentially if you think you have a rat-free area. And then also people in Northland, for example, I had a recent conversation where a community group that has done really well with their kiwi objectives, and they've now got kiwi flourishing in the area, population is really booming. And so that group now, with having performed so well and having a mobilized community of volunteers, they're now looking for the next thing. What's the next problem that we can start to tackle? And I can really relate to that. That's how I've sort of shifted my thinking when I came back to New Zealand, is I tried to pick what's the problem? What's my value proposition to the country? What am I going to do with my time and effort? What's the problem I would like to solve? So it's really cool to speak to other people that have that same mentality, and they're just looking for a problem to solve. So yeah, hopefully it can be bats for a lot of community groups. That would be fantastic if they would tag them into all their great work that they're doing. Anything to do with predator control, pest control, bats would be a fantastic add-on because they directly benefit from that work. The same as birds, right? It's just that it's a little bit less advertised, I guess, for whatever reason. Perhaps they're not as appealing. I'm not sure. But for me, I think bats is just a great add-on to a community project.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really curious about the ultrasonic recording and, like you mentioned, ability to pick up rat presence and also bat presence. And I spend a lot of my mental hours thinking about what potential futures we could live in. And I keep coming back to this thought of like a digitally embedded native forest that, we work in harmony with all the technologies emerging. And imagine if we had these recorders throughout our forests and it was for bats, but also for predators and for other like rats and other species that use the ultrasonic waves. And it all fed into a database that was being brought on live all the time. Like, how cool would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't think that future or that kind of future is that far away when you think about the huge capacity that's going in, that's being put in place, like for artificial intelligence, for example. Like that space is just nuts. Even in New Zealand, like there are people working on like call classifiers for birds, for example, even for predators like stoats. Like any kind of vocalization, you can work toward this automated identification. The issue that we're running into today is that we can collect so much data. We can just collect data all day. You think about in the freshwater space, for example, you install a data logger. It can record a myriad of different parameters for as long as it's in the water. But then you have the issue on the back end is like, well, what's your research question? And then secondarily, how do you analyze the data? How do you store the data? But I think that problem will be solved relatively soon, and we will have the capacity to process huge amounts of data. So then the question really becomes, once we have that capability, what do we do with it? I think installing these real-time monitors like in forests with specific outcome focus, like what's the research question you're going for, would be incredible. You can map at like a heat map of bat activity, for example. I've seen some recent research when I was at the conference in Cairns. People who deploy a myriad of detectors, and then you can map the activity over a night. And so you can really start to pinpoint where they're foraging, where they're roosting, how they're moving, where their flyways are. So I'm quite excited for like this high-tech future that's definitely coming.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's also going to lower the bar, especially for community groups to get involved. It's going to be so much easier to record and interpret what you're listening to or what's being recorded if it's outside of the frequency that we can hear. And I'm involved a lot in the Bay of Plenty with an umbrella organization, Bay Conservation Alliance, for example. And it's cool because they actually have bat recorders now that they lend out to their groups. And I've really seen an uptake here in the Bay of more and more projects looking for bat presence and absence in their core project area. And exactly what you're saying, trying to implement them into their project because they are heroing whatever the first species was that they were out there to protect, be that kiwi, be that kokako. It's just really, really great to see.
So that's like an equipment library.
It is a bit like an equipment library, which is amazing. And we both know, Callum and I, that you're also working on the National Bat Survey at the moment. Can you talk us through that initiative? Because that is a prime example as well of involving your community for bat conservation.
Bat detectors are pretty expensive, right? Like they're high-tech pieces of equipment. If you're looking at like consulting spec things, you're talking thousands of dollars per unit. So bringing down the barrier to entry for someone who wants to detect bats is really important. So the project that I'm working with, I've utilized ultra low cost, they're called detectors. So these are detectors that are built by an engineer who's then had them manufactured. They're on like a PCB board, a weatherproof housing, with the express intention of putting them in the hands of as many people as possible, right? Like just making it accessible, because people want, if you're interested in something, there's a price point at which you become uninterested, right? And bats historically, like since the first detectors were developed, it's always been like a cutting edge technology, and it's always been expensive. Today, we're starting to see a lot of like really low cost detectors come on the market, and New Zealand's benefit as well as having only 2 species that we're likely to detect, and in many places only 1. It also means that we don't need oftentimes the highest spec equipment, although today even the ultra low cost detectors, in terms of a microphone, what you can get for the money is incredible. Like the detectors that we're importing cost wise are like an order of magnitude cheaper than what I use in my consulting role, right? So they're quite affordable. There's a number of different models that you can use if you want to be walking around it actively detecting, or if you want to go and put something out statically, like on a tree in the forest. And the big push that I'm making this year with the National Bat Survey is to allow people to upload data to a platform where we have an automated classifier. Now, this is like I can hear people in Europe saying classifiers, it's like a dirty word almost, because in Europe, the classifiers are really like they're utilized a lot, right?
So a classifier, can you just clarify
Like an
what that is?
identification tool. So you upload a file of a bat call and it will tell you it's this bat species.
Okay, cool.
It's
Yeah.
essentially like an automated process to, if you put out a detector, you will record a lot of noises. We cut them into 5-second recording chunks and then you analyze those. And that can be done manually or you can automate the process. I've done it for years manually and it's exciting for the first month, maybe. It's always exciting to find a bat where you didn't know there was a bat, right? But the amount of data we're collecting these days is massive. Let's again go back to a wind farm example. When you're putting in 100 turbines and you want to do a paired study, so then you'd have 200 detectors and you might do 6 surveys every year of 3 weeks each. And that's just a mountain of data.
A lot of
like
data,
the number of hours that you would require to chew through to just analyze the presence absence. And again, coming back to our lower diversity of species, it makes the problem of use of classifiers much easier. So in Europe or Sweden, even where I work doing call classification, they have 19 species. A lot of those you can't differentiate easily based on their call. You need specific calls of the species to know it's that species versus another one. So the classifier is useful, but it's not the final solution. For us, we have a much better chance of utilizing classifiers to give us really some pretty solid answers. I always recommend people do QA on their data. Like if you're a consultant doing an impact assessment, you need to look at your own data as well. You need to manually verify. But for a community group where the aim is like, do we have bats in our conservation area? This is a perfect tool where you don't need to be trained. You don't need to spend hours and weeks of sifting through data. The idea of it is like you can provide the initial tool, which is the detector, and then the subsequent tool or the software that people who are not, their core role is not bat surveying and reporting and analyzing, but they can still get all the benefits of that, but it's really at like click of a button. You know, the results typically come back in a few hours. We sort of say it's in 2 days. You just come back on a dashboard and it will have a detection. How many detections did you make? What days were they made? What time of night was it made? What species did you detect? What kind of activity was it based off the call? Like, is the bat likely to be commuting? Is it foraging? Is it social calls? So it's a huge amount of data that you can get without having to go really in the weeds and do, as I've done, like really go deep into acoustics, right? Like I find it really interesting. So I love going down into the weeds and investigating it. But for a lot of people, you just want to have an answer, right? So that's kind of the market that we're tapping into. But that, like, to get people involved where their role is really to put out a device into the environment and upload the data and simply get near instant feedback. It just opens up the door for people who, one, want to run a project and two, want to be involved in a project. And the fact that it's scalable. So that's why I've named it the National Bat Survey, because the idea and the benefit, I think, coming forth with the data processing and data storage capabilities we have now is that you can start to think about the scale of your impact. So rather than just being a local project, it can be national.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and good on you for launching it. I think there's something to be said for making it easy enough that your everyday person can get involved. So what has the community response been so far?
Yeah, it's been surprising, to be fair. The project has taken a long time to set up, actually. We were quite mindful that we wanted to partner with some well-known local groups and organizations. So we've partnered with Cape Sanctuary, which is out on the east coast, like out to the coast from where I live, and then Tamata Park Trust, which is the center of our survey group, and then Biodiversity Hawke's Bay, which is an organisation that looks to link all manner of biodiversity projects and people involved in biodiversity within the region. So again, coming back to that collaborative approach, but it also gives the project a little bit of social license in terms of people know these organisations. Once the project actually launched, the uptake was really, like, I was surprised. I really thought getting people to be enthusiastic about bat detecting, like my family, my kids are like, this is a weird thing that you're doing, Dad. Like, can you believe that you would? You know what I mean? I'm sure a lot of bat ecologists have the same thing. Their family's like, man, this guy's, what's he doing with his life here? But the community has really jumped on it. And a lot of people one of the most interesting things of the initial uptake of the intake forms that we have for the project is a number of people that have said, yes, we've seen bats on our property before, which, like, that's unknown in Hawke's Bay, right? Like, you have there's some reports, but that's an interesting component of the study itself, which I actually hadn't considered when I started it. But garnering information from people who either have confirmed, like, seen a dead bat, which I've had a few people tell me they have, or seen bats foraging around their garden or property. So that in and of itself is interesting. So yeah, I've been, like, genuinely surprised and really excited about the uptake of it.
Yeah, I can't wait for the learning out of that. I think it's fascinating. I also think it is so important on a community level, not just for the bats, but also connecting more people of the general public, raising the awareness that we do have these bats in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Hey, they don't necessarily do so well in majority of the areas. Look at what we've got. So how can people help protect bats across Aotearoa? Like, what are your top tips for people that they can do in their everyday lives to help bats?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one in terms of like in your everyday life. For a lot of people, you're unlikely to do anything that would impact bats, right? But even just supporting any kind of initiative to raise awareness about bats, simply sharing the fact that we do have bats in the country. And then I guess you can start stepping it out towards people who perhaps own a larger property, removing trees, anything that you might be doing vegetation-wise that could impact. It's like during like winter where they're in torpor, so less able to like fly away because they're sort of sleeping, if you want to call it that. Even talking to your local council about what they're doing to map the habitats of bats, like starting a bat project, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it? Not for everybody, but that'd be really cool. I hope the way we're setting up the models for Hawke's Bay is that it's transferable, that someone can grab templates and run their own project. Like that's the scalable side of things. You can think about things like lighting, right? There's a whole bunch of things, but I think for me in New Zealand, it comes down to the distribution. There's no point doing things in an area that there are no bats left, right? So I'm kind of focusing this year on, at least around my local area, where are bats? Are bats here? Where should we be asking people to do things for bats? Because one thing you don't want to do is ask people to do something where there's no benefit, there's no meaning behind it, right? You've got a limited amount of goodwill. People are asked all the time to do all kinds of things. You're recycling, you're separating your trash, you're turning your lights off, all kinds of things, right? People these days get a little bit overloaded on all the asks that are getting asked of them, you know. But it's like anything with any kind of nature conservation or initiative or anything. I guess it's just be supportive of the people who that's their thing. So if somebody's doing something for bats in your local community that you know of, just be supportive of what they're doing, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, thanks, Mark. Can you tell us, like, what does conservation mean to you?
I don't say I've worked in conservation for my career, but it's definitely how I think of my relationship with nature is like I'm working as a consultant, but my overall objective is conservation. But I think for me, what it means is like constant learning. For anyone looking to be involved in conservation, I think that's probably my take home for anyone is just keep learning. You might go down a road and actually want to backtrack. That's not the thing for me, and that you can contribute in a myriad of different ways. I never thought I'd be running a national bat survey citizen science project even 5 years ago. It just wasn't on my radar at all, you know, and yet now I've found a passion for it, and it's just through that continuous learning. Everything I've done in my travels, it's all just to learn. You know, I go and work with people who are more experienced than me so I can learn more just because I'm interested in it. And it's all, you'd put it under the banner of conservation, you know, but when I tell people what I do is I just learn about stuff that interests me. That just happens to be animals, really, like freshwater and bats, as it turns out.
And it is so true, and you never stop learning and they never stop surprising you. So for people who want to get involved, how can they either support the National Bat Survey that you're currently doing, or if they're outside of the Hawke's Bay for now, what can they do to put their hand up and say, yep, that's what I'm going to do for bat conservation?
Yeah, the easiest way to reach out for anything to do with the National Bat Survey is just on the website. So the batcolab.co.nz. You can sign up to the National Bat Survey. You can look at how to sign up to the platform where we process the data. Anyone that has full spectrum data, so if there's somebody out there with a data set that they'd love to run through the platform, if they would like to put it into the National Bat database, you can put it through. Like we obviously charge a processing fee for uploading the data, but then at the end of the season, all that data will be incorporated to the National Bat Survey. But if people want to check out what the Bat Survey is, how perhaps they could start their own project around their local area, get in touch with me if you want to have some templates for how to set up the project and stuff like that. Otherwise, my contact information for email and stuff is on the website. If anyone's got any questions about it, feel free to reach out. If anyone is interested in doing any kind of survey work, join the National Bat Survey to be part of that community, and you can sort of listen and learn of what's going on and choose if you want to get more involved or not.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And if they need professional consulting, talk to Mark.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I offer that service as well. There's a number of people around the country, fantastic bat ecologists, so I'm sure we can put you in touch with someone who's in your local area. But yeah, certainly if you think you need bat advice for a project, reach out. There are people out there that can help you with it.
Thank you, Mark, for coming on today and sharing your knowledge with us. It's been so interesting to learn more. Bats fly under the radar a lot, so thank you. No pun intended. So thank you for lifting the curtain for us today.